Good morning. I'll be with you in just a moment. Okay, good morning. Today I'm going to continue my discussion of Dr. Stephen Eisenstat's essay from this book, Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, edited by Mary Stein and Thomas Arzt, Volume 3. This is the last essay in this particular volume, and I've started my discussion of Dr. Stephen Eisenstat's essay. The essay is called "The Quest for One's Own Red Book in the Digital Age," and we were last week beginning a subtitle called "The Digs, Journeying, and Deep Imagination." Now, I only got through one paragraph last week, and just a minute, I have to admit one of my panelists. I only got through one paragraph last week. Good morning, Nick. Nice to see you.
Hi, Skip. Nice to see you.
I'm starting with, I'm going back to this subtitle entitled "The Digs, Journeying, and Deep Imagination." And I have a few starting things that I'm dealing with here. Good morning, Art. And nice to see you here, Art Patterson. Nice to see you. So last week I got through about 8 lines of this particular section of this essay. And so I'm going to read those 8 lines again, but I'm not going to discuss them again because we discussed them at pretty great length last week. And so this week, what I'm going to do is I'm going to reread that paragraph, and then continue on to a point that sparks my imagination to discuss with you. And so here is what I read last week. Underground, down under, in the worlds below the world, I have come to observe that the numinous, for the most part, has been banished from above ground viewing, not destroyed, but forgotten, not lost, but abandoned. Only as an adult have I come to fully remember and see with new eyes the psychic radiance that sparks all creation. Over recent years, and particularly after my reading of the Red Book, I have made my way back to the home place of the illuminated imagination. Okay, so that was the paragraph that I read last week, and I just want to observe for everyone that later on today, about 5 hours from now, I will be doing a Wisdom Path session with Dr. Stephen Buser about this book, Map of the Soul, 7, Persona, Shadow, and Ego in the World of BTS. And the reason I mention it right now is because I think a lot of men are sort of, especially young men, are confused by why so many young women are attracted to BTS, the Korean boy band. And it dawned on me finally what this is all about. And this relates to the same phenomenon that we saw back 60 years ago with Elvis Presley and the Beatles. and so on. And it relates to an instinctual function in all species. And I normally describe this function most simply in another species, which is the osprey, the sea hawk. And in the sea hawk, there are three things that have to happen between a male and a female before they mate. Okay, the first item is a sky dance. In other words, the male does some fancy flying around the female to attract her attention, number one. Number two, he builds a nest. He has to build her a nest. And number three, he has to bring her a fish. And those three things, you can see it throughout the bird world because the males tend to be the brightest colored of the species of each species. For example, the cardinal is bright red, but the female cardinal is sort of a dull brown in color, and so on. And you see it in many bird species. But the point is that we do that too in terms of our mating rituals and our courting rituals. And so in our courting rituals, the male normally has to get the attention of the female. And that's often done by wearing colorful clothing. For example, women are often attracted to red and blue uniforms of military guys, and partially because those uniforms have colorful ribbons on their chest and so on. And so still in the human species, men have to get the attention of women, number one. Number two, they have to demonstrate that they can feed them. And so typically the custom is that the man will take the woman out to dinner during courting. And during feminism, that women have tried to go Dutch treat and that sort of thing, but really the instinctual purpose of it is for the male to show the female that he can support her when she is having children. So in the case of the osprey, he's bringing her a fish, and he has to bring her fish for 40 days quite reliably. And in the human species, he takes her out to dinner. And then the third thing is that he has to, in the osprey, he has to build a nest. In the human species, ultimately, before you're going to have children, the female has to be pretty sure that the male can keep a roof over her head while she's bringing children into the world, especially very young children. And so that's normally the same process in the human being as it is in the osprey and every other species, probably, those functions. And so in the world of BTS, or the Beatles or Elvis Presley, that represents a sky dance. So when we see phenomena where all these young women are attracted to these bands, they're obviously in effect doing the sky dance. And BTS dresses in very bright colors and does dance and so on. And so that actuates instinctive interests in the female. And so that's why. So if you think back on the Beatles, the same phenomenon was happening, the same with Elvis Presley, and the men gradually catch on. Okay, but the issue with a rock band is that they have 80 million followers, and so they can't possibly do the rest of the courting ritual for all those females. And gradually the young women realize that, and then they start getting attracted to young men who are more in their sphere of influence, and the other parts of the courting ritual do take place. And then boy meets girl, and the rest is history. And so, so that's one of the topics that we'll be discussing today. I'm certainly going to ask Steve Buser that question this afternoon, about a little less than 5 hours from now at 1 o'clock U.S. Eastern Time. These sessions that are about BTS have attracted a lot of attention among the BTS armies, and you don't have to be a young woman to be attracted to the BTS group. I'm very attracted to them, and I'm 74 years old now. But what I like about them is that I consider them educators who have turned the whole education process on its ear. And for years and years, probably 20 years, I've worried about how we could educate young people about psychological issues. And the Jungian analyst group isn't going to do it because they have their own silo. And basically the Jungian analyst societies around the world, the Jungian societies around the world, are basically for adult interest and also to attract analysans to their practices. And so, very few young people are at a stage in life where that's important. And so the Jungian analysts aren't going to do it. And Jungian thought barely gets mentioned in psychology at all, because the modern psychology that's mostly based on Freudian thought is based on statistics. And so now they just say, oh, you're depressed, here's a pill for that. And of course, we see the problem with that, as in this country, we've been killing, 2 years ago, it was 72,000 people on opioids. And so the pill solution isn't really a very good solution. And Jungian psychology, on the other hand, helps people understand their own psyche, and therefore understand a way to survive and keep their mental health. And so that's what presumably all of you who are watching, and I appreciate all the people around the world who are watching on YouTube right now. And in the United States, it's very early. And so I do appreciate the fact that you come to these sessions, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have as we go on, and we'll talk more about how to participate with us regularly in a few minutes. But anyway, the point is that BTS is doing the first of these three mating functions, and from my perspective, or from an adult's perspective, they're teaching Jungian psychology. In the last year and a half, they've done 2 albums that have been entirely about Jungian psychology, and they've created great interest in the younger generation. And as a result, there will be a new generation of young people who are going to explore what Dr. Jung explored, which is the psyche itself. Now, let me just see. I want to put onto the YouTube chat the link. All right, so this is the registration link, and I'm going to do that here. Okay, so now on the YouTube chat, you have the link so that you can be notified about these sessions, and so that you too, if you wish to, can participate in our panel. All right, now going on. So Dr. Aizenstat continues. The downward expeditions of the digs may be incubated during struggle and strife, or apprehension and fears. So what he's saying is that what brings people to mental health professionals very often is some sort of struggle or strife and apprehension and fears. So people have panic attacks, and your parents might die, and that's quite shocking. And so people have a hard time pulling out of the depression that's around those, and often that's the realization of death. Ernest Becker, who was a psychologist of the mid 20th century, wrote a book called Denial of Death, where he said that really everything that we do is really an effort to deny the fact that we're mortal. And so that his thought was very popular in the late 20th century. And Bill Clinton even said that he carried this book on his honeymoon, which I can't, I personally can't imagine carrying Denial of Death with you on your honeymoon. But, you know, go figure, he became the president of the United States, and I'm here talking to you. So he had some success somewhere along the line. And so I can highly recommend that book, Denial of Death, by Ernest Becker. But the point is that people come to mental health professionals very often because something has gone wrong with their life. And, you know, I think of a number of cases in my own lifetime where I probably should have talked to a mental health professional. And one of those was when I was 18 years old. I was a freshman in college, and I was like 10 weeks into it, and we came to our Thanksgiving holiday, and I took a ride with another student, and actually four other students from my college to Washington, D.C., where my then girlfriend was living. And halfway down the road to Washington, we had an auto accident, and the boy that was two to my right, I was sitting in the back seat behind the driver. The person that was on the passenger side was killed. His neck was broken because we got hit by two oncoming cars, and the closure speed was about 100 miles an hour, maybe more. We were probably going 50 to 60 miles an hour, and so were two oncoming cars. And it was in the rain, and these two cars hit, and the boy two over from me was killed. The boy next to me had his pelvis broken in two places and his collarbone broken in two places, and was out of school for a year. The young man at the in the passenger side had his arm broken. and I was the only one to walk away from it. And as you might appreciate, it was quite traumatic in its own right. But then, because I was the only one that had been in the car that was conscious after the accident, I was called upon to go into the morgue of the hospital and identify the body of the young man who was killed. And because his neck was broken, I could see how the bone was protruding from his neck. And it was a very traumatic experience for me. I nearly flunked out of school. I nearly killed myself 3 weeks later when we were leaving for a Christmas vacation, and my roommate and I had bought a fifth of Johnny Walker Black Label whiskey. I'm sorry, it was Johnny Walker Red Label, so it wasn't even the good stuff. Johnny Walker Red Label whiskey, and the two of us drank that entire fifth of whiskey in a half an hour. Okay, so I drank at least a pint of whiskey in a half an hour, and luckily for me, I survived it. I survived it mainly because I heaved most of it up, but we might easily have killed ourselves. And I did that because I was so crushed by the experience of the accident, and I was trying to deal with the emotions that were still working very heavily in my psyche. And then I came back from the Christmas vacation and got 4 Ds and a C in my first semester of college. So I nearly flunked out of college as a result of that accident. And I would have been very well benefited if I had spoken to a mental health professional at that time. I really wish that I had done. Fortunately, another aspect of it was that my parents were in Japan, so they were on the other side of the world from me. And so when I came back to college, the thing that saved me was that my college advisor basically assumed the role of my father, became person in loco parentis, and started to work with me to get me back in the game. And the result of that was he saved me, saved my college career. And, I owe my college career basically to that man who sadly died a few months ago. But the important thing is that he provided mental health support for me. He didn't know that he was doing that. I don't think he thought he was being my advisor in college, but that kind of support is needed when you have a trauma. And so when that happens, you have to go into yourself and find your foundation. You have to find what supports you. And in my case, what supported me was the fact that I got extremely busy. I took a lot of courses, and because I was almost the lowest grade point average in my college class at that point, I had a goal of being the most improved student in my class. And because I had that goal throughout college, that kept me going and kept me studying and working very hard in my studies and also in my extracurricular working life so that I could support myself. And so that saved me. And I didn't succeed. I wasn't the most improved. Somebody else had been worse than me. But I got a different award instead. I got an award for writing an essay about the political responsibilities of educated young men, which was an interesting experience in its own right. Um, so, uh, so anyway, often things come and save you, and so I'm always referring to the scene in the movie The Sound of Music when Maria is down in the dumps and the Mother Superior says to her, well, whenever God closes a door, he opens a window. And so certainly God opened a window for me in the sense of getting me back on track by bringing me my professor and bringing me a goal to achieve, to give meaning to my life during my college days when I didn't have my parents around. And that helped me quite a lot. And so that's one of the things, but of course, losing a parent is always traumatic, regardless of your age. And so all of these things cause us to go inward. And so this is what Dr. Aizenstat is referring to. Okay, so he said, and I'll read it again, downward expeditions of the digs may be incubated during struggle and strife or apprehension and fears. However, my inaugural descent did not germinate in a state of personal or professional crisis. Although the plunge was down, vertical, and deep, the initiation itself was spawned by insatiable curiosity. So in Dr. Eisenstat's experience, he was just curious about what was down there, and that was partially incubated by his experience on Zuma Beach in California. So if you were here a couple of weeks ago, you will know what I meant by Zuma Beach. And I won't go into that now again, but that curiosity from being on the beach and seeing what he saw caused him to have insatiable curiosity, which any 12-year-old young man would definitely have under those circumstances. Okay, going on. Similar to my youthful passion on Zuma Beach, I was driven by a desire to rediscover the unknown in the known. And so the point is that we live in two worlds. We live in the external world that you can see and touch, and we live in our psychic worlds. And what many Americans have missed, many Americans live in the external world. So we think, many Americans think that it's important to have the right automobile in your driveway. And as Nick would know, in Singapore, it's very important to Singaporeans who have the money to drive a Mercedes-Benz because it's a status symbol. Okay, that's the external world. And gradually people realize that, that Mercedes-Benz might be good as a status symbol, but most of the time it's sitting out on the street or in the garage, becoming a depreciating asset. And in the end, all automobiles have four wheels and deteriorate, require oil changes and the whole rest of it, whether you have a Mercedes-Benz or a Jaguar or a Ferrari or a Volkswagen. So that's the significance is it achieves what it achieves for you. And it's the same thing. And so if status is important to you, then you're living in the external world, but you're not paying much attention to your being And that's what we're here talking about today. We're talking about your deep unconscious, yourself, what drives you, what makes you tick. And um, so that's the unknown. And we have to, once we get familiar with doing that, then you're going to live a more healthful life, a more meaningful life. And so, just the things I've said this morning about BTS, for example, where I talk about the sky dance and plumage and birds. As young men hear that lesson, they can immediately say, oh, that's why BTS is so popular. Now I have to think about how I can clean up my act to attract young women. If I want to have a wife and children, I better clean up my act and make myself more attractive to young women. That's what it's about. It's about the sky dance. Okay, so Aisenstat goes on. My inaugural dive into the depths began not in a sacred ceremony deep in the Amazon rainforest, but rather in one of the small, ubiquitous coffee houses in the Pacific Northwest in the town of Everett, Washington. I sat in the cafe with my journal to do what I most often do with my dreams. I write them down. The dream the night before had been a simple showing of a scene rather than a major announcement or revelation. The tableau was of a bubbling creek behind a shopping mall in the California neighborhood that I grew up in. Between coffees and homemade pastry, I sketched the locale in my journal. As I drew, visual images opened up. The creek came into life, animated by a remembrance of the actual creek bed that I had visited secretly when growing up. I drew a circle over and again. It became denser and more spiraling, inviting a journey down below the brook into the wet sludge at the bottom. The earth, pebbles, and soil beneath the creek were unfamiliar, very different from the underwater sand and seas in which I had spent a lifetime free diving and exploring in the oceanic dreamtime. A portal was opened into foreign geologic places, and I was reluctant to go there. I hesitated. This is dirt, not ocean. How mundane, I thought. There is not much life in this inanimate life. There's not much life in this inanimate landscape. I packed up my personal journal and left the coffee house. That afternoon, a friend and mentor encouraged me to return. A portal has presented. Nothing. Now go and explore. So the point is, this is why we should write down our dreams and do active imagination, which is what Dr. Aizenstat was talking about. And what happens when you do that, when you pay attention to your unconscious, it will open out for you. And so I'll tell you the story of my dream in the sheriff's office as an example, and you will see what I mean, because I had shortly after Donald Trump was elected to president, I had this dream. I dreamed that I was a reporter and I wanted to go to a southern town and attend a Ku Klux Klan meeting. And so my idea was to dress up in white robes like the Ku Klux Klan and to bring a partner along who was from the local community. And I could take pictures and do a news report about the Ku Klux Klan meeting. That was my plan and my dream. And suddenly I found myself arrested, and I was put into an old style American jail for my audacity to sneak into a Ku Klux Klan meeting. And then I was brought out into the sheriff's office, and sitting behind the desk was the sheriff. And this sheriff had a white beard and long gray hair, and he looked every bit like the God that we imagine in, for example, God waking up Adam in the painting in the Sistine Chapel, for example, that sort of look to him. But he was wearing this sheriff's uniform. And that was the end of the dream. And I said, whoa, that's interesting. What's that dream about? And so I had written down that dream, and I took my wife to work, and that was about a 2-hour evolution to take her to work and come back home. And so I had been out of the dream for a couple of hours, but I said, wow, I think I'm going to try to do an act of imagination and try to understand where that dream was coming from. So what happened was I got home, I put myself in a sort of meditative state, and I put myself back into the sheriff's office. And immediately, I just imagined myself back in the sheriff's office with the sheriff. And I said, had said to myself, I want to know what's going to happen next. And so I put myself in that state. And so in that state, then inside the sheriff's office, we realized that there were a throng of people outside, and they were shouting about me, and they were screaming about me. And we looked outside, and they were all Ku Klux Klansmen, and I was quite concerned and worried. And so this is in my imagination now, not in the dream itself. And so the sheriff said, come with me. And we stepped out onto the veranda of his sheriff's office. And so there was this throng of Ku Klux Klansmen around the sheriff's office. And the sheriff simply raised his hand, and suddenly this sea of Ku Klux Klansmen spread very much as the seas spread when the Jews crossed the Red Sea to escape the Egyptians in that scene. But this was a sea of Klansmen. So there was this passageway between the two sides of this throng of Ku Klux Klansmen. And so I looked down this passageway, and there was the rising sun, but it was eclipsed by a black eclipse. In other words, the moon had come between the sun and the earth, and it was a full eclipse, but it was also the rising sun. And so the sheriff pointed to that, and as I watched, the sun started to move, or the moon started to move aside, so that the sun was no longer eclipsed. And then suddenly it started to get light and bright again, and suddenly I find myself in a meadow on a bright sunny day, and everything is wonderful. and birds are singing and so on. And so that was my active imagination. And so what I had done was taken my dream, put myself back in the dream, and then let it evolve further. And what it told me, or what my self was telling me, my God image, because the sheriff amounted to my God image, okay? What my self was telling me is that even though the sun is eclipsed by this election of Donald Trump, it will pass. It will be over at some point, and that the world will be bright and meadow-like again. And so that was the message that I took out of that experience. And that's what Dr. Aizenstat is talking about here, where he's meditating on a dream that he had had the night before, and he wrote it down, but he thought it was kind of mundane and stupid. And somebody told him, a portal has presented, now go explore. And so, that's what I did in my personal experience. And that's what Dr. Aisenstat ultimately does here. So he went from a dream to an active imagination. So if you ever have a dream that's very shocking, you can put yourself back in the dream, even especially if it's a nightmare. You should put yourself back into it and then see where it takes you. And it might surprise you. So here's how he talks about it. So in the white night of the Pacific Northwest, when the evening light softens but never quite gives way to darkness, I sat at the same table in the same coffee shop and began the geologic dig. Down I drifted weightlessly into the vast expanse below. A rock formation at the familiar childhood creek had become a portal into an awe-inspiring underworld. Once landed, I was face to face with others, fellow journeyers, or emergents, as I have come to call them, were streaming in from far and wide. Many who arrived were elders and mentors. Others emerged from the lands of the dead in the forms of ancestors and ancients, immortals of the deep soul. There were long familiar figures, too. The personage of a forgotten lover, dream animals that had lingered in my imagination, and soul companions of dreams who had afforded wise counsel over many years. My companions on the creek dig were friendly, greetings all around. It seemed like a reunion, and I felt privileged to be included. After everyone was introduced, the procession continued to descend, and we were directed into caves where a guide told us that to go deeper, to see the worlds behind the world more clearly, we needed to be grounded in skeletal resonance. Before you go further, you must feel it in your bones, he said. We began and embodied singing and chanting the songs of the dead. I felt my body soften and my breathing deepen. I looked around and was relieved to see that my companions were also transforming in ways that made safe passage possible. I remembered Orpheus had been put to death for being unprepared for his underworld journey, and I did not relish the same fate. What I witnessed next will shape my work. What I witnessed next will shape my work with others, particularly the next generations of students and family members, for the rest of my life. Okay, so he's gotten into this active imagination. He's gone deeper. He's found that the other beings that are in there with him, which are actually parts of himself, of course, and his own psyche, are actually his helpers, and they shape his life. They shape the rest of his life, and Dr. Eisenstat's life was non-trivial because he was the founder of Pacifica Graduate Institute, which now is the main or the most prestigious degree granting institution in the US that focuses on mythology and on Jungian studies. And so he was the founder and the chancellor of Pacifica. And that was 45 years ago now, I suppose. And the Rocket King says on YouTube, morning, Skip, I consider this my Sunday service now. That's maybe apt because the point is, and I'm learning this too along with you, but I have a friend who is a psychiatrist now retired of 40 years standing, and I asked him, what is the purpose of these sorts of things? And, why is it that if I read Jungian books, if I'm upset or something, all I have to do is pick up any Jungian book and start to read a sentence or two, and suddenly it puts me into my unconscious and makes connection for me with my unconscious, and it soothes me. And I always experienced that. And and this is what traditional religions also do. So, for example, when I was 30 years old, as many of you know, I was a deacon in the Reformed Church in Greece, New York, a suburb of Rochester, New York. And so I was a deacon. I was doing all the traditional things a young lawyer might do. And and I was having the same kinds of trouble thinking about organized religion that many young men today, especially nihilists, feel, which is these religious myths aren't true, and we've proven that with the scientific method. So we can look back to the Big Bang and we can look down to the Higgs boson, and we don't find God anywhere in those. And the point is that that God is not a thing, okay? God is, and God is existence itself. It's not that God exists, God is. And so, so the point is, as the psychiatrist pointed out to me, is that when you connect to this unconscious realm, it soothes you. And so I was finding that while I was having this trouble of many young men in not understanding my religion from a physical, logical point of view, but I would go to the services, and when I came out, I would feel better. And the reason is that religious services have, from time immemorial, as Dr. Jung pointed out, been psychotherapeutic methods. And let's see, I often share this one quote, but it doesn't hurt to do it again, so I'm going to do it again. Dr. Jung had one quote that really sums this up. And so let me see if I can find it. Okay, coming up. All right. So I found it. Now I have to share it with you. Okay. So theologians and psychologists are in the same business. Quote, For thousands of years, the mind of man was worried about the sick soul, perhaps even earlier than it did about the sick body. The propitiation of gods, the perils of the soul and its salvation. These are not yesterday's problems. Religions are naturally evolved. I added those two words, naturally evolved. Religions are naturally evolved psychotherapeutic systems in the truest sense of the word, and on the grandest scale. They express the whole range of the psychic problem in mighty images. They are the avowal and recognition of the soul, and at the same time, the revelation of the soul's nature. And that's from Civilization in Transition, Volume 10 of the Collected Works of C.G. Jung, paragraph 367. And so that's why, as Rocket King says, he considers this his Sunday service, and that's what a Sunday service does for you. It puts you in connection with your soul through ritual, through tradition, and in various ways, in the same sense that getting back into a dream and then watching it play out can also do that for you. And so Gray Blue says, I very much appreciate this knowledge sharing. Have you already discussed the map of the soul? No, that is going to be this afternoon when we do the session with Dr. Buser, who's going to talk with us about this book, Map of the Soul 7, Persona, Shadow, and Ego, and the World of BTS. And so I urge you to come back. That session will now begin 4 hours and 3 minutes from now. And I will send out one more reminder about that, only to the people who are on the MailChimp group. This is how I this is how I stay connected with people. I have a MailChimp account, and you need to go onto that account and select the things that you want to have notices of. And so this afternoon, probably about 3 hours from now, I'm going to send one more notice, and that will be only to people who have marked BTS as educators of the 21st century as their interest. And so if you go to the link on the YouTube chat, which I've just put up on the YouTube chat, and click on BTS, on that BTS interest, then you will get the notice and how to get onto that session. Or you can watch it on YouTube also. But on YouTube, it may be difficult for me to connect with your chats because I'm going to be quite busy. The last time we had something about BTS, there were 446 people on the live stream, so it made me as the host quite busy. And so, all right, now going back to Dr. Eisenstat's essay here, and I'll just reread that last paragraph just to remind you. What I witness next will shape my work with others, particularly the next generations of students and family members, for the rest of my life. And that's my point about BTS. Because they've put books about C.G. Jung's psychology on their website, they've turned education upside down. Instead of being forced to go to school and learn long division or the rhyme of the ancient mariner or something like that, which everybody thinks, oh my God, I've got to learn that. They've turned education on its ear so that now the students go to that website and they say, oh, what are these guys learning now? I really need to learn about that. And so it's made the students pull the education instead of it being pushed on them. And so that's the point about BTS, and it's going to change a lot of young people's lives, which is what I'm very impressed about. I mean, I'm not a teenage girl who's having my instincts opened up for the first time by a sky dance, but I am definitely interested in the phenomenon and understanding the phenomenon of what they're doing, and being able to see, as I do, and I think Dr. Buser does. He's the publisher of Chiron Publication that publishes a lot of Jungian material. They have created such an interest in Jungian psychology among an entirely new generation, and the implications of that will be playing out for the next 80 years, probably, and for the history of the world. And it's all because of these 7 young men who dance in brightly colored outfits and do amazing dances together. And so it's really worth seeing. Okay, so Aisenstat goes on. From the caves, we were led into the Catacombs, a dazzling place of light, where a galaxy of shimmering gems and crystals served as lenses through which we could see into the deep imagination without upper world light. These worlds beyond the world revealed a stunning display of what was, what is, and what will be possible. In the Red Book, Jung says, because I have fallen into the source of chaos, into the primordial beginning, I myself become smelted anew in the connection with the primordial beginning, which is the same, which at the same time is what has been and what is becoming. So Dr. Jung is simply pointing out that we have things in our unconscious that are causing us to become. In other words, everything that an oak tree is in the acorn. Okay, and so everything that the human being is in the fertilized egg and sperm. And so when the egg is fertilized and begins to grow, it already contains everything that you will be for the rest of your life. And individuation is about understanding that and becoming a part of that process rather than fighting it, basically. And many people do fight it. And so when Dr. Jung says, and Dr. Aizenstat says, smelted anew, what he means is, okay, we are brought up as children in a certain way, and we get a certain attitude, and we're a certain way in the world. And then something happens that can be quite traumatic. And then we're put back on our own resources, and we have to be smelted anew. And so, example of that in our current affairs would be the so-called Proud Boys, who I call the Lost Boys. Now, what were the Lost Boys in the movie Peter Pan? They were young boys who lived in an imaginary world with Captain Hook and the alligator and Tick Tock. But what happened is that Wendy, the anima figure, grew up and left the Lost Boys behind. And so if you don't grow up out of those games that you play as a child, then you're going to stay a lost boy. And so I consider the Proud Boys to be like that, because they like to play in the woods with their guns and so on, and they like to puff up their chests and so on. But are they going to create a civil war in the United States? Well, no, they're not. And the reason they won't is because they won't be prepared to give up their SUVs and their big screen TVs and that sort of thing. And there's quite a qualitative difference between fighting a war and playing in the woods with your guns. And so if they were going to have if they were going to have a civil war, they'd have to be prepared to live in the mountains and be partisans and attack Americans in our peaceful lives. And of course, most Americans will not stand for that. And so our police and our National Guard will attack them. And so, for example, I have a friend of more than almost 60 years now who wants to puff himself up. He rides a Harley still, and he's in his 70s. He puffs himself up by riding a Harley, and he says he has 50 guns at home. Well, first of all, why do you have 50 guns at home? You're only going to be able to use one. And and he claims, oh, well, it protects me from my government. Well, no, it doesn't, because the government has tanks and F-18s and Raptor fighter jets. And so having 50 guns in your home is not going to protect you from your government. That's a fantasy. That's like being a lost boy. And that's basically what the Proud Boys are. And so those fellows are about to have a traumatic experience. I'm not saying that President Trump will win or lose the election, actually, because it's not clear that the American people have learned the lesson. But if Donald Trump is defeated in a landslide vote, which is what I'm expecting, then those Proud Boys' fantasy of owning the northern United States as a wilderness that they can have as a separate country, that's not going to happen. And the rest of us won't allow that to happen. And unlike the president, who thinks that there's a riot on every street, actually, if we go to our local grocery store, we see Americans cooperating and working together perfectly well. I mean, we have people of all races and all ethnic groups and all national origin groups interacting perfectly peacefully in our country. And we do that every day, and that's true everywhere in the United States. And so the people that have this fantasy that they're going to create a whites-only country, that's a childish fantasy, an immature fantasy. Now that, and so when that fantasy is popped, they're going to have a lot of growing up to do because Wendy has moved on, and so And I'm not saying that there won't be some dust-ups. I'm not saying there won't be some violent eruptions, that some of these guys, as an example, that young 17-year-old kid who got involved with some of these people and went to Kenosha and killed a couple of people. Well, his life is ruined too, because he's going to spend the rest of his life in jail, most likely. And even if he gets off by some of these crazy defense theories of self-defense and all that baloney, even if he gets off, he's always going to be the kid that killed these two people. And he's never going to be able to live that down. And so that will be a personal hell for him. And so, the same will happen if there are some eruptions after the election. That will be put down very, very quickly by our governments in various forms around the country, regardless of who they are and regardless of where they take place. And those guys will go back to playing with their guns out in the woods, which is not real life. That's a fantasy life that they're living. And that's the way the human species has learned over many years. I mean, even Al-Qaeda and ISIS are examples of that, where guys get these crazy ideas that they can overthrow the world and live in this world where they dominate. And that can happen for a period of time, as we've seen, but ultimately they're going to be defeated by the maturity of their own populations. It won't be the US that comes in and changes them. They will ultimately be defeated by their own immaturity. And so that's the way I see it. So even if Donald Trump were to win and the next 4 years played out the way many of us fear it could play out under those circumstances, his style can't be allowed to continue in a mature society. And so whether he gets dismissed now or 4 years from now is really irrelevant. I think it'll be bad for many of us if that happens. And it will be a very painful and bloody lesson that we have to learn. But basically he's trying to pull these plays out of the Nazi playbook and what happened when that happened in Germany. In Germany, it took 25 years to work it out of the system. And it didn't get worked out of the system until all the crockery was broken in Germany and the country was destroyed. And the same in Japan, where I lived as a boy, and where my high school building was the only building left standing in Yokohama at the end of the war. And so the rest of Yokohama was basically flattened. And so we hope that we as a species have learned these lessons before that kind of destruction takes place. And I believe we have done, but we need to express these lessons to young people who don't understand them. Because, in the end, that can't be allowed to, childhood fantasies can't be allowed to dominate our societies, and they won't be allowed. And so that we may be going through a brief bloody time now, or if Trump is reelected, it may be a longer bloody time, but in the end, it will end, as it did in Germany and Japan. And so, for me, I'm not very concerned about what's going to happen in the election, because the consequences will speak for themselves either way. And the fact is, we're not going to have a civil war. That cannot be. And I think most of my fellow Americans know this, but we'll see. So anyway, going on with Dr. Aizenstat. So I will read the last sentence. Because I have fallen into the source of chaos, into the primordial beginning, I myself become smelted anew in the connection with the primordial beginning, which at the same time is what has been and what is becoming. And so what we're seeing right now in current affairs is the United States and the American dream being smelted anew, and something new will emerge about that. For me, I'm quite confident about that. And, I believe many of those young men who like to run around with beards and shoot up AR-15s, most of them have never been in combat or seen a friend killed in combat. And they will see some experiences, like the young man in Kenosha, the 17-year-old in Kenosha. He never experienced what it's like to have something real happen to you. And he was living a fantasy, and his life is now destroyed, every bit as much as the two people who were killed. Whether he gets off in his criminal case or not, because he will never live that down. And so what I expect is that a lot of these people who are think that they're going to overtake the Michigan Capitol and things like that, they're going to grow up and change their tune because they've matured. And it's a shame we all have to go through their maturity process, but nonetheless, that's what it is. So, but by the way, then they will become my fellow Americans, and I will respect them as my fellow Americans because they have been through this individuation process, and they've learned the consequences of what they're doing. All right. So next paragraph. My digs continue to this day, each one delving deeper, around and through the unknown, the unseen, and the uninhabited dimensions of deep imagination. The landscapes in my initial exploration were mostly familiar to me, places that had been cultivated over years in the practice of active imagination. As they continued, the digs descended to new and unfamiliar expanses beyond the known and the oceanic. And so that's what happens, that if you learn to explore your unconscious, then you find out what you're about. Okay, so for example, 1968, which was the year that I graduated from college, was a very, very divisive year. There were civil rights demonstrations going on. There were anti-war demonstrations going on. Robert F. Kennedy was murdered, and for 8 weeks before that, on April the 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King had been murdered. And so things were pretty bad. And when Martin Luther King was murdered, there were riots in Washington, D.C. And the result of that is that to this day, there are still buildings in Washington, D.C. Within a mile of the Capitol, less than a mile of the Capitol, a few blocks actually, which still show the scars of those riots from 1968. So we're talking about 52 years ago. And so when I've been living in the Washington area now since 1986, and so 35 years. And whenever I have visitors, I take them on a tour of Washington. But I always start that tour with a tour of the 8th Street corridor, which is in Northeast Washington. And the reason I do is to show them those scars and to show them the scars which are the result of America's shadow. Okay, that's America's shadow. The murder of Martin Luther King happened because of the ugliness in the American psyche. And when shadow things happen, like those riots, they do leave scars, and those scars are still present in Washington, D.C. So if you ever come and visit me, I will take you on that tour, and you'll see what I mean. It's been largely cleaned up these days, but there's still some evidence of it. But 20 years ago, when I was living on Capitol Hill, 25 years ago, that part of DC was still a mess. And even today, there are those scars. So what I was going to talk about, though, was that when things happen that are very traumatic, and so here I was in 1968, I was a second lieutenant in the U.S. Marine Corps. I was being trained to go to Vietnam and fight in a war. And my sister, while I was in the basic school, sent me a 3,000-word stream of consciousness. This was fiction, but nonetheless, it was very realistic. A 3,000-word stream of consciousness of a young man, what goes in through his mind when he's shot in Vietnam up until the moment that he dies. And so it was a very gruesome piece. It had been published in an underground newspaper in London, where my sister was, and she was calling upon me to desert from the U.S. Marine Corps. And she was calling my father, who was a career naval officer, a fascist, which is very, very far from the truth. And but nonetheless, she was experiencing. In that same year, she was 17, and she had witnessed the Chicago riots at the Democratic Convention, where there was a lot of police brutality deployed. And so she was fed up as a 17-year-old, very much like this Kenosha young man. And so she ran away from home at age 17 and disappeared for a month. And not only did she disappear, she disappeared in London. It was a very traumatic time. And, but here I am. I'm sitting in the basic school preparing to go to war, and I get this missive from my sister. And of course, that put me back into my deep unconscious, because that was a stream of consciousness of what happens to this young man as he's shot before he dies. And so the result of that was that I had to examine myself. And finally, I wrote a letter to my sister, and I said, well, if I hadn't accepted the possibility of that happening to me long ago, I wouldn't be where I am now. And so I had, in my college career, even though I went to what I call a little lefty college, I was the only member of my college class to be commissioned on graduation day. And I always knew that I was going to go into the Marine Corps or I was going to go into the military. I was hoping to go into the Navy. But because the military was the family business, and I had grown up with my father being a naval officer, I always intended to go into the military. And so throughout my college career, I knew that that was going to happen. And so when I was blocked from the Navy because of poor vision, I simply went to the Marine Corps instead. There I was welcomed, and I became a Marine Corps officer and served to Lieutenant Colonel over a 23-year period. And so I simply said to my sister, if I hadn't accepted the possibility that that would happen to me, that I would be shot and killed in Vietnam, I wouldn't be here now. And oh, by the way, our father is a patriot, not a fascist. And indeed, my father joined the Navy as a sailor before World War II in 1940. And, it was before U.S. was into World War II. And he was aboard the ship that sank the first U-boat in World War II. Even before Pearl Harbor, this occurred when a U-boat entered the U.S. Freedom of the Seas area. I don't know, there's a 12-mile limit that belongs to each country. And the submarine had entered that area. And so his ship sank that submarine, and that happened I believe in the summer of 1940. And my father happened to be on that ship that sank that submarine. And so, from my perspective, my father was a patriot getting ready to fight a fascist dictatorship. And I didn't see him as a fascist, but my sister, who was 17 years old and too young to know any better, called him a fascist. And, as it happened, the man who was my roommate at the basic school did get killed 5 months later after we graduated. He was killed on April the 11th, 1969. And so, the Grim Reaper passes by often. And if you happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, you can end up dead, as happened with the man who was in the car with me after in my freshman year of college, and happened with my roommate at the basic school. Both of those men died young. And it happened with my brother, who died in 1988, and tomorrow will be his 72nd birthday, but he died at age 39 because he drank purified water out of the Colorado River and got giardia into his intestines, and over time, over a 15-year period, it ate his liver. And so in 1988, he went through 3 liver transplants, and the third one, after the third one, he died. And so his experience, the meaning of his life, was to give medical science a lot more information about what can happen in liver transplants. But he lost his life. He gave his life for that purpose. And so I will be missing him tomorrow. Okay, all right. So, all right, so I've read that paragraph. Let me go to the next paragraph. So Dr. Aisenstat says here now, during these voyages into the depths, I am not alone, nor am I leading a team. The success of any dig is inseparable from the guidance and grace-filled presence of the others, the co-journeyers. In each pilgrimage, I am joined by new and unexpected figures. Look there in the distance. Other entities approach, indigenous to the world of pain, emergent are among the most vital companions on these underworld treks. Some of the formidable presences I've met include Voltaire, who knows the fear of death, left out, rejections, sultry twins, and Kali, the emerged. Okay, so Dr. Aizenstat, who's a very accomplished Jungian analyst, learned that the figures that can appear in a dream or an active imagination are actually a part of you. They're all a part of you. And you can learn to love them because they're part of your journey with them. But, if you don't know what it's about, then it can be shocking. And so, for example, in 1993, I was possessed by an anima figure, my anima figure, and over an 8-month period, she caused me to write a novel. And the novel is quite dramatic, and it's basically her autobiography from 1962 until 1993. And she is a part of me, which I now recognize thanks to Dr. Jung. And basically my conscious mind was quite shocked by what went into that novel. And I put it away for 16 years. But finally, after 2009, when the Red Book came out, I said, oh, wait a minute. If this could happen to the most famous psychiatrist and psychologist of the 20th century, then maybe I'm not crazy. And so then I made a commitment to myself to publish that novel. It had been in my drawer for 16 years. I made a commitment to publish it I made a commitment to publish it when I was 70, which I did. And so it is now on Amazon, but only in Kindle version. And the name of the novel is Mako, Memoirs of a Woman. And so you may think it is a it's kind of odd for an American man to write a memoir about a Japanese woman, but I had a lot of experience in Japan. I knew what I was talking about, and that was the experience of my anima in truth. And everything that is in that novel happened to either me or someone I know intimately. And it's putting it kindly, it contains some features of erotica, so you shouldn't go look for that novel unless you're prepared for that kind of material. It is written under my pen name, which is David Carrots, and I published 2 books on Kindle under my pen name, David Garrettson. And the thing that surprised me is that every woman who ever read it that said anything to me about it said that she loved it, and I think it is close to the lived experience of many women as well. But for me, it was the experience of, my anima figure. And so it is a part of my life. It's a shadow part of my life, certainly. And as I said, I didn't know what it meant until I had done a lot of study in Jungian psychology. But anyway, yeah, that's a different story. But I'm not keeping it a secret any longer. So if you read it, you read it. Okay, so the synergism of the digs gives voice to darkness as well as light, which is what happened to me, of course. Anger as well as joy, alienation as well as communion. Pilgrimages into the abyss conjoin the horrific and the beatific, as well as other polar opposites that thrive in the world above. In the Red Book, Jung addresses the inseparability of goodness and evil in the spirit of the depths. So in your depths, if you start to explore them, the first thing you run into is manifest evil. And so that, for example, is reflected in the sheriff's office dream that I was telling you about, where the manifest evil was the Ku Klux Klan in that case. And so here's a quote from Jung that Aisenstat puts into his essay. I understood that the new God would be in the relative. If the God is absolute beauty and goodness, how should he encompass the fullness of life, which is beautiful and hateful, good and evil, laughable and serious, human and inhuman? How can man live in the womb of the God if the Godhead himself attends only to one half of him? And so, that's the point. And that's why Jordan Peterson found Ion the most frightening book he ever read, because from Jordan Peterson's point of view, who considers himself the savior of the Logos, Christianity and the traditional religions have focused on the good, and so Christianity sells God as the all-good God, and Dr. Jung was pointing out that since God is all, that you have to take account of also the evil part of God, and so that's what Ion is. And it's the recognition of that that is, can be very shocking to someone who's been brought up in the church, because we've all been taught that, oh, God is all good and he's going to grant you all your desires, and he's this kindly Geppetto up there in the world, and or in the sky, and he's pulling your strings, and he's going to make your life successful. That's how theologians have been selling the Christian God for the last 2,000 years. And unfortunately, that's not the way God operates. And God isn't a Geppetto that's pulling your strings. And so the sooner we realize that from a psychological point of view and understand what God is, where he lives, and how he goes about doing the work of the Godhead, the better off we're going to be. And that is the genius of Dr. Jung, because Friedrich Nietzsche at the end of the 19th century said that God is dead and we have killed him. And what he meant by that is that through the Enlightenment, which I actually call the Endarkenment, the scientific method had disclaimed everything that was in the Christian myth. And so it was already true by the end of the 19th century that the God that had been sold by theologians was already dismissed by certainly most men and a lot of women, dismissed as, not true, and why should I go to church anyway type thing. And Dr. Jung came along in the next generation and found the living God, where he lives and how he goes about doing the business of the Godhead. And we could also say he found the living God where she lives and how she goes about doing the work of the Godhead. I have a new guest coming on to my Zoom chat. And so maybe we'll have a discussion. Who knows? Welcome, Dick. And as long as your mic is muted and you don't use your video on the screen, you will not appear on the playback on YouTube. But if you do choose to interact with me and any chat you put onto Zoom won't appear on the YouTube, but if you speak or show your face, it will come up on YouTube. So it's your choice, and welcome. I'm glad you chose to join me. And if you want to privately send me any comments on the Zoom chat, you're certainly welcome to do that. And you're welcome to come on and help me discuss some of these issues. We currently have a congregation on YouTube, which is who I've mostly been talking to for the last 30 minutes, because my friend from Singapore, Nick Chan, has had to go, had to leave the session. But anyway, welcome. And so we're talking about heavy things here. Okay, so maybe I can get to the end of this portion of Dr. Eisenstat's essay today. So he goes on. Every time I descend further into a dig, I am opening myself to the imagination matrix. And remember the matrix. This is the matrix. I am opening myself to the imagination matrix, the dominion where soulful discoveries are nurtured and thrive. And so I would observe that movies today perform this part of this function for us, but they do it in a passive way. You're not actively participating in it. And so you think that, oh, Luke Skywalker is out there, and Star Wars is out there, and it's fiction anyway, but that's actually not true. Uh, Luke Skywalker is within all of us. All of us. Star Wars is within all of us. And if we want to live a successful and happy life, we need to understand that those things are in us, and they're showing us that they're giving us images, but we have to understand that they also can be within us. And so now in my lifetime, I've probably seen 3,000 to 4,000 movies. And whenever something happens in my life, very often a movie scene will come into my mind. And actually, the dialogue from that scene will come up, and I'll remember that, Luke said this or Luke did this. And so, what the first episode of Star Wars, which was called Episode 4, the very first one, is actually a demonstration of the ego. Okay, it's a demonstration of the development of the ego. And so Luke goes through all kinds of battles in that first Episode 4. And at the end, the movie ends with him going into this large auditorium with a throng of people present, and he's awarded some big award. Okay. And so everybody thinks that's individuation, but that's not individuation at all. That's just having the success of developing a strong ego. And so what that episode of Star Wars represents is primarily the development of a healthy ego. And as you go on in the series, of course, the prequel movies are what leads up to that episode, and the later movies, particularly Star Wars 8 and 9, show what happens as we become more wiser in our old age. And so all of the movies, do show a version of this ego development. So what we do during the first part of our lives, and we go through a lot of crises and so on, and we build up our ego and become strong, as, for example, everybody does by the time you're 40 or 45. You've had children, you've had a spouse, hopefully successfully, and if you were in the military, you might be retired. I mean, keeping in mind that the captain of an aircraft carrier is only 45 years old, typically 45 to 50 years old, probably more like 45. And so the average age on an aircraft carrier is something like 20. Okay, so most of the young men who are driving that aircraft carrier around the sea are younger than 20, a lot of them. And even the officers who are pilots, most of them, the squadron pilots, are probably 25 or under. And the leaders of the pilots, the squadron commanders and so on, they only may be 30 or 35 years old. And the same with the officers that are driving the ship. And so that's a period of ego development. But then you get to if you retire, let's say that you have a successful hi Dick. We have your mic going now, and I hear a dog that's trying to eat your lunch, I guess. So, did you want to say something, Dick? Okay, I'm going to mute your mic. So, Dick, I muted you once again. Not that I'm angry with you, but I wanted to take the dog out of the video. But if you have something to say, please do unmute yourself and say what you wish to say. Okay, so now going back to the aircraft carrier, if you're a captain in the Navy and you're 45 years old and you're the captain of an aircraft carrier and you've been in the Navy for 25 years, you're eligible to retire. Okay, so now what do you do with the rest of your life? That's the question. You might live to be 100, and it's fairly routine for people to live into their 80s and 90s these years. And so your life has to find meaning after that. And so that's what individuation is about. And that's why Dr. Jung was focused on the second half of life, because he was more interested in that than psychological development per se, because once you get up to that point, age 40 to 50, and maybe you're a little younger these days because people tend to be precocious. So let's say you can start this stage when you're 35 these days. And, we have young people studying Jungian psychology, so it might start even younger than that these days, thanks to BTS. And so people may realize that they have more development to do, and that development tends to be reaching the connection between the ego and the unconscious. And so remember, there's a biblical force, or there's a biblical verse, which is in the first letter of John, 1 John 4:1. And that verse is, examine the spirits, whether they be of God or not. And so the point is that the spirit will bring forth both good and evil in our lives. And it's necessary to develop a strong ego in order to be able to distinguish between good and evil. What are the things that we want to bring into the world and enact in the world, and what are the things that should remain in the shadow and which are evil? And if we enact them into our physical life, they're recognized as evil. So, for example, the young man who went and murdered 2 people in Kenosha, that was obviously an evil part of him that was getting the better of him because he didn't have a strong enough developed ego. And in his case, that probably ruined his life that night. Whether or not he ever gets off from his criminal case, he's never going to get away from that experience. And so he learned a very valuable lesson at the expense of living a peaceful life. He never will have that, even if he never never gets convicted and kept in jail. And so, we need a strong enough ego to decide between good and evil. And that's what one gets by the age of 40, 45. This is why more mature people tend to be leading countries and that sort of thing. And so Jaguar says, so true. I'm in my early 40s and I feel like a newly born person in the last few years. It feels like I'm more me than I was before. It feels grounded in the ether of the universe. Shauna says, Eminem, rapper, talked about reconciliation with his shadow side in the song Monster. Yeah, and this is, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, for example. This is exactly what it is. And so Shauna says, same for me, referring to Jaguar. I found peace in my early 40s. Jaguar loved Eminem's early work. I think I was the right age then to enjoy it. Probably true. Okay, so where am I here? So I'll go back maybe. Every time I descend further into a dig, I am opening myself to the imagination matrix, the dominion where soulful discoveries are nurtured and thrive. Like the universe itself, the imagination matrix reveals the psychic dynamism of all being and all non-being. I do not know who or what will show up on a dig, just as I do not know what birds will fly above me in the light of the daylight sky. The personalities, animals, and landscapes of the underworld have their own lives, and they move in and out of my sight in their own time. Unlike the constructed algorithms of the programmer's code or the avatars in a computer game, the figures and manifestations that flourish in deep imagination have an unpredictable spontaneity. And when they do come forward and announce themselves, I am surprised. The theater of the depths presents dramatic and restorative shows that entertain as they enlighten. This is why algorithms and artificial intelligence are never going to replace human beings, because you can't replace that functionality through a program, through an algorithm. You just never can get there. I've been privileged over these past years to be able to take a quantum leap, or more aptly, a leap of faith into learning the ways of illuminating dream images. By peering through the translucent screens affixed to the imaginable bodies of dream images, modes of perception have opened that allow me to set a metaverse of interacting soul sparks and to hear a symphony of long lines reverberating in dream time. Engaged in the praxis of dream tending and digs, we must meet the embodied dream image with our imaginal or archetypal ego bodies, not our rational minds. We use our senses. We touch the ocean. Is it warm, cold, or freezing? We taste and smell the seawater. Is it tropical or arctic? Ocean enters the room with us, not as a category of thought, but as a living, autonomous, embodied image of the dreaming psyche. So if a vision comes into your mind, it's because it's a living part of your psyche. Through the transcendent, we can discover our transparence. Through dream tending and the exploration of the digs, we become permeable. We find our places in the translucent fields of the deep imagination, where we are connected to more than what exists out there. And we experience a recovery and an awakening of uniquely intimate places in here, just as the psyche knows no bounds other than those that have been placed on her. The matrix of imagination is free-flowing channel to the infinite. the sky is the limit, and the earth opens into the vast depths of inner space. And so this is a comment that I made long ago on the Archetype in Action website, that Carl Sagan and Neil deGrasse Tyson, the way I said it in my essay, which was some years ago, was that they missed an entire universe because they think everything has to be in the physical world. But the truth is that they've missed 7.5 billion universes, because we all carry a universe in our psyche, and every one of our universes is different. And so we have to understand that, and understand that the universe in our psyche is every bit as infinite as the infinite physical universe outside. And once you know that, then it makes it very interesting to explore it. And this is why I've been studying Jungian psychology now for 33 years. It's why I get bemused by something like BTS, and why I'm teaching the Tarot on Monday nights, because all of these things open up the imaginal universe and help us live our lives. Let's see what else is said here. Shauna says 21 Pilots also references it in their song Heathens. I think there is a lot of music for young people out there that is opening these channels. I agree with that. And Jaguar says heavy language to decode indeed, can be sensed, felt before it can be cognitively understood. Yes, I agree with that. And Jaguar says, yep, the different realms in our psyche. Okay, so my voice is now failing me, and I have another probably 3-hour session to host this afternoon that is about BTS. And so once again, I want to put onto the YouTube channel the registration page to receive my notices. And you should only register there if you want to receive my emails that remind you of the various sessions. And there's a choice of different categories that you can pay attention to. And if you include a category, then if I send an email to that category, then you will receive those emails. Now, today or last night, I sent an email to everyone, and I now have about 600 people on this list. And the reason for that is that I consider the BTS session we're going to have tonight this afternoon, to be about all of our psyches and the way the psyche works. Today's focus will be by the publisher of Chiron Publications, Dr. Steve Buser, who, and mostly what Chiron Publications mostly publishes is books that relate back to Dr. Jung's work in some way. And so, for example, this series that I'm using for this series of talks on Sunday mornings, Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, edited by Mary Stein and Thomas Arzt. Today I was reading from volume 3, but this series is published by Chiron Publications. In addition to this book, which is about BTS, Map of the Soul 7, Persona, Shadow, and Ego in the World of BTS. And as you can see here, if you're lucky, Steve Buser is one of the authors of this book. And so the session this afternoon, starting at 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time, Eastern Daylight Time, will be focused on that book. And so I will send out at noon today, my time, which is 2 hours from now, I will send out one more reminder only to people who have put BTS in their interests. But I sent one last night that was to my entire list because I consider Dr. Buser, of general interest to my entire list, in addition to the BTS focus of this afternoon. And so I hope that you'll all join me. If you register on that MailChimp registration before noon today, you will receive my notice with the link and the password. And so you'll be able to join the panel. And if you don't, you can still watch for the live stream on YouTube, because I will be live streaming on YouTube at that time as well. But thank you, Dick, for joining me here on Zoom, and thank you all. There have been many who've been listening to all or a part of this session today, which I appreciate. And I'm going to terminate at this point so that I still have a little voice left to participate in, and I have to host the session this afternoon. So I'm going to terminate now, and thank you very much for joining me today. I'll see you at 1 o'clock. And I will be online from 12:30 for people who want to come online early and take a position in the panel. My Zoom account will take 100 people in the panel and 500 people attending. So you will be able to attend, but you won't be in the panel if you're after I fill up the panel. And so I'm going to start accepting people at 12:30 my time, which is 12:30